When I first heard this news, I said to myself, you know what? That's actually a good idea. But then I had to look a little bit deeper, just a little bit deeper to see if it was exactly what I thought it was. And I'm going to share that with you here as well. So it appears that Donald Trump has announced a new tax proposal. He is announcing that he is going to eliminate taxes for anyone who makes under $150,000 a year. Now, believe it or not, that's a lot of people, particularly in this country. And of course, that would include people who are under the poverty line as well. Eliminate taxes. But is it really what we think it is? Let's dive into this clip here, ladies and gentlemen, from One. We're giving them some love over at One. We haven't talked about them in a while. Check this out.
U.S. President Donald Trump plans to eliminate tax for those earning less than $150,000 annually, exceeding 1.3 crore rupees. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in an interview said that he is working to make Trump's plan a reality. Lutnick said, and I know what his goal is. No tax for anybody who makes less than $150,000 a year. That's his goal. That's what I'm working for. Trump has pledged to abolish tip taxes and has pushed for massive tax cuts for people and businesses alike. And Lutnick's remarks on Social Security and tip taxes mirrored those pledges. There are concerns on surging U.S. debt and how tax cuts could weigh further. However, Lutnick asserted that other people, not Americans, would foot the bill. The Commerce Secretary said the United States was losing money due to offshore tax frauds, and if these scams were to halt, the government would have more money to spend on programs like tax cuts for the Americans.
So let me pause here for a second. So think about those offshore accounts, right? Like there are a lot of people who are billionaires. We'll use them as an example, and they have offshore accounts. Now, what does that mean, right? It means that they have accounts that are overseas. And they do this more so that they won't be taxed, right? Like that money is apparently non-existent. It's an offshore account. So according to the IRS, they don't even know it's there, or they don't know that it's there. So they won't be taxed on it, right? So I am in favor of eliminating like this process that happens where billionaires can have the offshore accounts and they're not responsible for that money that they made. Obviously, the rest of us don't get the opportunity to do that. And it's a way that they use to basically cheat the system. That being said, though, there's something that you really need to think about, because if we were to eliminate taxes on everyone who makes under $150,000 a year, again, that's a lot of people. Well, then you have to ask this question. You have to start asking, what exactly do our taxes pay for? Let me go ahead and bring this up here from Forbes. You guys got to see this because, again, there's more that goes into this than you realize. So from Forbes, they said that Trump's administration, no taxes under 150K proposal is a disaster. Interesting that this is coming from Forbes, but I guess maybe not. So I'll make this a little bit bigger for you guys so you can see. It says the Trump administration latest tax policy quasi proposal announced by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is for the elimination of taxes for folks making less than $150,000 per year. Trump's previous major tax initiative, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and provided rate reductions across the board. But a closer examination reveals who really won with the new policies: corporations and the wealthy. I also want to remind you, if we go back to 2017, don't forget that some of these corporations didn't pay any taxes, right? So like Netflix and Amazon didn't pay any taxes during that time. High income earners benefited massively, with the top 1% seeing a 2.2% increase after tax income, while all other taxpayers got some short-term relief in the form of a larger standard reduction. But we're also hit by state and local tax, SALT, deduction caps. If along with extending TCJA, tax cuts that disproportionately benefit high income earners, the Trump administration intends to eliminate the income tax for individuals making less than $150,000. It raises the obvious question of who will be left shouldering the tax burden. The answer is either the middle class or no one, because Social Security and Medicare will be shut down. Okay, so here's a portion of truth from Forbes, right? Which is that when we talk about eliminating taxes for people who make under $150,000, again, that's a lot of people in this country. But what do our taxes pay for? So some of those taxes go towards Social Security and Medicare. So if you have a giant chunk of the American population no longer paying these income taxes, these payroll taxes, then that would ultimately have an effect on Social Security and Medicare. But to that, I say there should be a workaround, right? Because the reality is you really don't have to use American taxpayer money to fund Social Security and Medicare. I'll get into that in just a second. We're going a little bit more here. The illusion of a tax-free system for the working class. At first glance here, Lutnick's proposal to eliminate taxes for those earning under 150K sounds like a windfall for working taxpayers. However, as with most tax policy promises, the devil is in the details. Dun, dun, dun. It is worth noting that most Americans in this income range pay more in payroll taxes than income taxes. Payroll taxes fund Social Security and Medicare. When Lutnick speaks of eliminating taxes on individuals making less than 150K, one must assume then that this includes both income taxes and payroll taxes, as the latter is the larger burden on individuals in that income range. It would make little sense to assume in his broad pronouncement of elimination of taxes, he means only the lesser burden of federal income tax. Listen to this part. You can't fund Social Security and Medicare without taxpayers. If the Trump administration truly intends to eliminate both income and payroll taxes for that bracket, we will be facing existential crisis for the programs that working and retired Americans rely on. And this is where I have to push back. The reality is you don't have to fund Social Security and Medicare through taxpayer dollars. This is something that the federal government could just pay for like they pay for other things. And I'll give you an example. For those of us that came from the military or military families, like my family was in the military, the federal government pays for a lot, right? For those of us that attended schools overseas, the DOD schools, who do you think funds those schools? It's not, the taxpayers like it is in the United States, where property taxes help with school funding here in the US. That's not the way it works with the DOD schools. The DOD schools overseas are funded by the federal government. And those schools in particular are actually pretty decent schools. Like I went to DOD school and I went to public school here in the United States, and there is a difference. When I was at the DOD schools, I didn't have to pay to participate in activities in school. I didn't have to pay to be in the band. I didn't have to pay to play on the basketball team. Everything was paid for. Actually, the only thing I had to pay for was the reed for my clarinet. That's it. The federal government pays for all of that. So one of the things that I've argued before is the same way the federal government can fund those DOD schools is the same way the federal government can fund these public schools. And you can do that by also cutting that large defense budget. I've talked about this a number of times. So I do have to push back a little bit there. The system as it exists right now, yes, that makes sense. Like I get what they're saying, but they're not talking about changing the system. That's a big part of the problem here. Social Security and Medicare are funded almost entirely through payroll taxes. If you eliminate them for the vast majority of workers, you're not reforming these programs. You're eliminating them entirely. So I want to bring up another example, okay? Remember during the pandemic, when several states in this country were locked down and there were a number of businesses that closed. I'll use my state, for example, and some of those businesses just went completely, out of business because they couldn't afford. Okay. So the point I'm saying is this. There were a number of people in this country during the pandemic that were not receiving a paycheck during that point in time. Thus, they weren't paying into the system during that point in time. But those programs still continued. How were those programs able to continue? The federal government jumped in. See, these are some of the things that people disagree. They just, I don't say disagree, but they forget about. During that time, during the pandemic, when a number of people weren't working and people lost their jobs or people were not getting paid, who stepped in to make sure that those programs would continue? That was the federal government at that time. Don't forget about the American Rescue Act, right? Don't forget about the child tax credit, even though these things were eliminated later on, like the child tax credit, et cetera. What it showed you during that time is that if the federal government really wants to step in and help the people, they can, right? So just remember that. It goes on to say here in 2023, payroll taxes generated 1.23 million, accounting for roughly 90% of Social Security's revenue and a significant portion of Medicare's funding. The entire system is predicated on there being workers paying in so that retirees and the disabled can get paid out. Benefits do not continue in the absence of ongoing payroll taxes. That's false, though. Let me highlight this here. It's like the example I just gave you. During the pandemic, when some people were not working and they lost their jobs, these programs still continued because the federal government jumped in. Put differently, if you exempt enough income brackets from payroll taxes, you functionally deprive these programs of funding entirely. Again, they're not giving you the whole story, but that's why you have me. Because you see, this is the problem, what they have here with this statement. The entire system is predicated on there being workers paying in so that retirees and the disabled can get paid out. What happens if you don't have any workers? So I would say the problem is that the system itself is inherently flawed. What would happen if we had another pandemic where the entire country had to shut down? What would happen? The federal government would have to step in. So that's a big part of the problem. But I want you to think about it from this perspective as well, because like I said, things are not what they seem. The reality is, and shout out to my producer, Eric, for this, we really need to ask who pays when it comes to taxes. Thank you for this, Eric. This is from his Substack here. So if you check out this chart here, this is what you'll see. 400 richest Americans, bottom half of income earners. So you can see this here, right? Trump has floated the idea of eliminating individual income taxes. This idea avoids a crucial aspect. What's most important is not the type or the amount of tax. What's most important is who is paying. Is it targeting the 99% who work for a living or the top 0.1%? In the graph above, we can see how the tax burden has shifted from 1960 to 2018, and it's a safe bet that the trend continues this present day. Yeah, so you can see this here. You can see how things have changed. If we go back to 1960, at that point in time, the people who were paying the most taxes were the richest Americans. But as we get closer and closer to 2020, as we're going down the timeline here, you can see that gap really significantly starts to close. So now we have 24% in 2018 and 23% there. So as you can see, we're paying a lot. And by we, I mean the working class, right? So this part here, which brings up a good point, this leads to a key question. What are taxes for? The purpose of taxes is to circulate money back out of the economy. How they are applied, who is doing the paying, is a key driver of wealth inequality. When the tax burden is shifted from the billionaires to the working class, wealth inequality increases. And this is what we've seen on steroids. So what do we do about it? We need to start thinking bigger. Rather than being distracted by the latest partisan theater over this or tax that, we should be demanding radical changes in the tax system, changes that would transform it from a driver of wealth inequality into a tool for fixing it. And if we shout out 11 demands, this is one of the demands. Revamp taxation and funding. Abolish all taxes except for highly progressive income tax, wealth tax, and taxes on large corporations. Use the tax system as a tool to address wealth inequality. Eliminate tax loopholes. Prosecute and potentially expel persons and corporations that abuse offshore tax havens. Charter a network of state-level public banks to benefit local communities and businesses. Issue federal currency to promote the public good, not increase private profits. It doesn't have to be this way. It starts with real demands. So to Eric's point, people have to start thinking bigger instead of just focusing on that one single issue, because this really isn't just about let's eliminate taxes for those who make under 150K. It's really about who's paying these taxes, who's paying the most, and then you can connect that to wealth inequality in this country. The reality is people who are lower income shouldn't be paying as much taxes as they're paying, and billionaires shouldn't be able to pay zero taxes or hardly any taxes. But that's what's been happening. And that's why we have massive wealth inequality in this country. So whether or not you agree with this tax proposal is kind of besides the point. The real question is, who will truly benefit? If you know someone that lives in a state where there are no income taxes, a friend of mine lives in Tennessee, no income taxes there, the state has found other ways to make them pay for other things, right? So they may not have income taxes, but they may have higher taxes elsewhere. Typically, a lot of times that's how it works. So what we have to ask ourselves again is, who's really paying? Who's paying the most? And how can we revamp the system? As I told you before, there are many opportunities where the federal government has stepped in. And we really don't have to use income taxes to pay for Social Security and Medicare. This can all be funded by the federal government. We have to think bigger. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.